Hey guys, welcome to the Massive Iron Channel. I'm Steve Shaw. In this video, I am lucky to have Alex Bromley on. Alex Bromley, earlier today I made a podcast mentioning you're going to be on. I don't know why I keep saying Bromley, so if I say Bromley, just give me a virtual slap. But I'm really happy to have Alex Bromley on. I've been keeping an eye on his channel for years. Never had a chance to interact with you, and we're going to dive into some topics, strength, and other stuff, whatever happens. Before we get into this, guys, please check out the links down below. This will be obviously on YouTube, but I'm going to have this on Spotify, iTunes, Podbeam, and all the links to that podcast will be down below. So without further ado, Alex, I appreciate you joining me. Tell everybody where they can find you on the YouTubes and social media.
Yeah, man, happy to be here. My name pretty much finds everywhere that I am. My YouTube name is Alexander Bromley. Alex Bromley with 2 underscores is my Instagram. And you can find my books on Amazon or on my merch store, EmpireBarbellStore.com.
I don't know why, man, but like when I see your name, I just want to call you like a one word, like Thor, like Bromley. You know, it's just the way I'm wired. So I appreciate you being on. For those of you guys that haven't checked out his YouTube channel, please head over there. I will link that down below as well. So I thought you were in California, but you recently followed Joe Rogan down to Texas. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I was in California. Me and my wife living in a 1-bedroom apartment for about 4 years, and we both made good money. Couldn't afford to get a house because it's ridiculous down there. So we made the leap. So now everybody we run into, recognizes us. We're part of the insurgency.
So I like to kick off everything, and because I'm curious a little bit with YouTube, because when I started YouTube 11 years ago, just making random crap, just sitting in my office making random crap, just talking about lifting, and curious when you started YouTube, and did you were you completely organized and focused at the time, or did you make a lot of random random uploads early on?
Well, it wasn't random early on, but it wasn't focused either. I mean, I always knew that I wanted to work for myself and it would have something to do with lifting beyond just training people at LA Fitness. So I had been looking at, I don't know, the ads you see for making money online since I was like 19 or 20. I had read a lot of books. I was working towards that, but I didn't know what it would look like. And the advice early on, if you're looking for it, is pretty standard. If you want to do something on YouTube or online in general, you find a niche, you make sure you're an authority on it, you help people solve a problem. That's about the end of it. The rest is just logistics. I started seriously making videos, I want to say 2018 or 19, towards the end of 2018, I think. So it's been about 3 years or so. And the first video I did, it was just a topic I researched. Didn't see anything on it. So I thought, okay, this will do well. And it was on weight cutting. It's the first thing. I was cutting for a contest. I was like, there's no videos on weight cutting. Let's see how it goes. And for the first real video I put up, I think to date, it's still my best one. It's over 500,000 views, I think. So that kind of sparked everything after that. And then I kind of got hooked. And then I was like, all right, let's do one about training. Let's do one about this program review. Let's do one about squatting. And the content just kind of kept itself going since then.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned 500,000 views. Those kinds of videos can spoil you. I once made a video called Natural Bodybuilding as a joke, and I'm not an anti-natural bodybuilding, but the message was, a lot of the guys that are getting up on stage, it's just a little bit flat. They're not really training hard. It's not always a super impressive sport, but that got like 2 million views, and those are extremely rare. You're like me, I imagine, when you get like 10,000 views on a video, it's like, oh, happy day, right?
Yeah, and that's the hard part, because you see the difference between a video that's going to bring in views of your audience that you want to capture, people that will follow you and really want your message and will watch videos repeatedly. Something like that hit because the thumbnail said how I lost 35 pounds in 5 days. So of course, like most of the people clicking on that, they just want to lose weight, or they just want a quick fix to a problem. They're not interested in my 5 tips for building up your deadlift or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, and it is something to be worked around, and especially with experimenting, trying new things. It's like I try something else for a week and my viewership tanks. I go back to the old ways. It's like I can maintain a certain threshold. It takes a lot of trial and error. It's frustrating, but it's rewarding.
Yeah, and it can mess with your head a little bit. And there's always a temptation to like step out of your lane a little bit. And I mean, there are guys that do, and I'm not being critical of it, of them, but like I just always wanted to be about lifting and stuff I liked. And there's always a temptation over one of your on one of your shoulders to do something a little bit that stretches that. But at the end of the day, and I'm sure you'll agree, I'm sure you understand this, it's more important to build your people or your tribe, your posse, and build people that come to you for your videos than it is to build big numbers.
I would agree with that. Yeah. And God, there's so many ways I could go with that. I'll look at videos or other channels, even if they're not lifting related, just to try to figure out what they do that's successful. And there's so many channels I come across that have huge numbers, but it's not because they have a particular audience. It's because they got really good at capturing trending topics, or because they're so good at the editing that anybody who happens to fall into it just gets hooked for a long watch time, and it gets rewarded for that. And I couldn't imagine doing that. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm here because I feel like I'm filling a need, and it's kind of satisfying my itch to go back in time and fix the things I screwed up for so many years. But it is a very real thing. You're sitting here, you're in front of a camera, you're in a room by yourself trying to give your opinions on things. It's super easy to either get kind of unreasonable in the way that you're projecting an opinion. That's something I struggle with all the time. It's like, okay, if a group of my peers were in the room, how would I hedge my language? It'd be a lot different than if I'm yelling at a computer screen trying to get people riled up towards a certain thing. And then the clickbait stuff or the topics, like there's so many topics that people make videos out that I don't care about. And if their audience does, that's fine. But yeah, you definitely have to balance kind of the integrity of the thing you want to say with the real need you have to make it clickable or to make it appeal to people so they watch it in the first place. Definite balance there.
Yeah, there's something called transient viewers, people that just kind of do hit and runs because of the title, or they get shoveled the video on YouTube. And transient viewers, I while I appreciate them stopping by, they're not going to join my tribe. They're not in, and that's fine. Hopefully they'll find somebody else to rally around. So let's go back to when you started training. How old are you, by the way, Alex?
I'm 35.
35. I'm going to tell. I'm going on 55. So it's hard for me to judge sometimes with those sexy beards. But when did you start lifting? And when you started lifting, what kind of pulled you into the lifting world?
So, I mean, I think as far as new lifters go today, you and I probably count as the same age, because I think our experiences are probably very comparable and probably markedly different from what people experience today. And that's another dynamic, right? Making that shift where you're trying to figure out the problems people have today versus the ones we dealt with. I think I first picked up a weight. It was like 1999. I think I was in high school. I think I was a freshman. I was overweight as a kid, never played sports, was not social, still not super social. But I got to a point where I just wanted to make a change. And I kind of had this ingrained belief that it was impossible. And I was really kind of sensitive to anything that pulled me out of that, like anything that looked like hope, I guess. And I remember I actually stopped by a Goodwill the other day and I found the book and I actually repurchased it because I got nostalgic. One of the first things I ever read was just a generic, like bestseller fitness book. It was Body for Life by Bill Phillips.
Right.
And I remember just being fixated on the before and after pictures and all the stories. And that hooked me. And I started doing like, I don't know, bench dips on a chair and push-ups and body weight squats. I think we had 125-pound dumbbell, and then I would, go for a run. So through high school, I got a little more fit as I hit my growth spurt. And then I ended up playing football just out of nowhere. I was like, well, I need to commit to something. And that was probably the best thing I've ever done. I was scared shitless. I got knocked over the field over 3 years, but it was one of the most transformative experiences I've had, which I probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that. So after high school, I just wanted to keep lifting. And that's where I sought out strength sports, which were not popular. They were very hard to find. There was no social media. I don't even think there was YouTube when I started competing in strongman. And I just had to kind of claw my way towards finding these outlets that kind of scratched that itch to keep competing after high school was all said and done.
Yeah, man. I mean, I remember I got on the internet in the Wild West days, back when there was like Critical Bench. I actually wrote a couple crappy articles for them back in the day when I was a dipshit. Now I'm an advanced dipshit. And they had like bodybuilding.com in the early stages and like Get Big. But I remember it all being mostly bodybuilding focused, which, isn't bad, but there just wasn't a lot of powerlifting, strength talk, and not even a lot of strongman stuff. It was still pretty fringe.
Yeah, completely. And that's funny. That's back in the day where you could just put your background on your website with a bunch of keywords and then just change the font to make it blend in, and you would rank for stuff. That was before like you could pull some easy, dirty tactics to rank. And now there's a definite set of rules you got to follow. Yeah, when I started, I knew that strength was where I wanted to go. I found that out very early. But at the same time, bodybuilding was all I had to influence me. So the first magazines I bought were Flex and Muscular Development, because that was all that I could find that was out there that had something that looked like relevant information. And I still have kind of a love for that style of training. And sorry about that.
It's all right.
I think there's very much a value to having that base of training. And I think back in the day, a lot of people used to do that when they were younger before they started to focus and specialize. But I know the couple of years that I spent just doing every exercise for tons of sets and reps, getting comfortable with fatigue and training to failure and doing a shit ton of volume definitely set me up. But then eventually I had to like seek out powerlifting. I think there was like a Borders next to us, and I had to go to like the Borders a couple towns away to find a Powerlifting USA back when it was in publication. Like it wasn't popular. Strongman was non-existent. I mean, I remember in 2006, that was my first competition. There were maybe dozens of shows every year. And now there's probably 500 or 600 a year in the US alone. So it's definitely hit a big upswing. Probably in the last 10 years, it's gotten huge. When I started, they didn't even have a women's division. Kristen Rhodes, who was world's strongest woman for a long time, is a really good friend of ours. She had to compete heads up against the guys. I was at a contest in Northern California where she competed against the under 200 guys and mopped them up. But that's how small and niche the sport was back then.
Yeah, for the younger guys that are watching, or the guys that weren't as connected to lifting and strength sports, back then like you are now, it's easy to go on the internet, and powerlifting and strength is just like, in some ways it's almost stronger than bodybuilding. You go on your feeds and there's lifts and maxes and talks about RPEs and like it's completely almost this. It's normal. It's just normal part of the conversation. But if I can share a quick story, I started lifting in '86, and I was in a small gym in Socorro, New Mexico, in college, and all we had was Flex and Muscle and Fitness, and I had like Joe Weider's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding, all black and white. And just to frame things, I didn't even hear about powerlifting or the deadlift until 2006. And I consumed this stuff for, like it was part of my soul and my fiber. And like the deadlift just wasn't something that was obsessed about. And I'd never heard of the sport of powerlifting until then.
Yeah, I can relate to that completely, because my in was watching World's Strongest Man, and I thought it was the coolest shit ever. and I would have to schedule it. I could only see it on Christmas on like ESPN2 is when they would air it, and then occasionally you catch a repeat. But that was before, before DVR. That was before TiVo. So I actually had video cassette recordings of World's Strongest Man episodes that I would watch over and over. And that, even with that specific focus in mind, it was impossible to find. Powerlifting, I remember there was one time I saw that, like, I think the Mountaineer Cup, it was one of Ed Cohen's last big events. He was with like Brian Siders, a couple other big guys. I had to wake up at 4 a.m. to catch it on ESPN2. And that was the only TV publication I'd ever seen of powerlifting. It was extremely obscure. Now, I think part of the reason that the strength sports were so obscure was, it was kind of a freak show. So powerlifting went through this thing during the 80s and 90s when they really went crazy with the suits and the equipment. The prototypical powerlifter was morbidly obese. Nobody could relate to what was going on, even if you lifted. I lifted and I couldn't relate to what a bench press looked like in a shirt or anything else. And it put a lot of people off. So there was a resurgence, around the time you said, 2006, 7, huge resurgence. Raw powerlifting came back. They actually made definite divisions where they separated, because it used to be one, multiply and raw together, and they got rid of that. So now they actually have raw divisions. People could compete, and it just appealed to so many people. It just lowered the barrier to entry, and you just saw the surge. I think CrossFit had a bit to do with it too. CrossFit funneled a lot of people to barbell sports that would not have otherwise found it. So it was kind of the perfect storm, but I'm happy it's here now.
Yeah, if I can share a story, I was a machinist back in 2006, and I think the economy tanked around that time. But I was working. There was this big dude. You could tell he was a mountain of a man, right? You could tell he lifted, but you could tell like there was a little bit something left to center in his mechanisms, right? I knew he wasn't a bodybuilder, so he would start to talk to me. We'd talk about lifting, and he started mentioning things like West Side and wide stance squats. I thought he was fucking nuts. I'm like, a wide stance squat? Are you brain decayed? What, like, and then he started talking about this sport called powerlifting, where they would gather on a Sunday, work out for 3 or 4 hours, drink beer, eat pizza post workout. I'm like, maybe I ought to check that out. That sounds kind of cool, because I'd been lifting for 20 years at that point, basically, just maintenance mode forever and ever. And I got laid off from work. I ended up starting a website called Muscle and Brawn. And we just started getting more and more into strength. It actually competed with Powerlifting Watch for Powerlifting Forum of the Year a couple of years, or with Bodybuilding.com. It nearly beat Bodybuilding.com a couple of years. And that I was kind of there at that growth period, but man, it was just not a lot of conversations, not a lot of mainstream conversations.
Yeah, it was definitely something that was counterculture and appealed to a certain personality type. And it's a trade-off, because I like to think I started strongman in kind of the early days before it was cool, where I lived in Southern California surrounded by 20 million people, and I had to drive up to like Clovis in the middle of nowhere. It was a 5 or 6 hour drive just to compete. It was very small backyard, a lot of strange personality types, but I think fondly of it back then. There's almost this thing where like you want it to grow and get bigger, but at the same time, now we're dealing with, when punk rock goes mainstream, and everyone's like, oh God, I miss the days where it was like just my little weird obsession. But the West Side thing is funny because their branding was very good. I think that's one of the brilliant things that Louis did beyond actually that was just masterful marketing, because it pulled a lot of people in. They saw the black and white pictures and the chains and the meatheads with the rolls on their neck, just like moving huge amounts of weight. And it definitely appeals to a very unique personality type.
Yeah, man, I'm lucky being in Ohio. I'm kind of around, West Side, Elite, a lot, close to the Arnolds. Laura Phelps Sweater, I forgot her name now, is close to me. I'm kind of in the middle of all that. A lot of guys from West Side used to train at our gym. that used to work or train at Westside. I think I got into powerlifting around 2011, and the meets to me were super intimidating at first. It was like you take all the punks and the metalheads with tattoos and leather and beards and sweat and stink and farts, and it was just like there's chains and circus acts, and
Yeah.
I'm like, man, this. But the thing you learn really quickly was like it was a supportive group for the most part. You're old, you gotta, you're handicapped in some way, you're blind, you're young. It was just a really supportive environment. At least it was, on my end of the world.
Well, and I think that was a big draw of it too, because especially if you were involved in equipped lifting, what a lot of people don't realize is how small that kept the talent pool, because it added this extra barrier to entry where you need a crew. You can't do multiply bench or squat by yourself. You physically can't. You need 3 or 4 guys to be able to, rotate in with you, to give spots, to help you into your suit, to do all this stuff. So by default, it was rare because not a lot of people could find crews like that. It's not like now where you could just go to the gym and do a squat workout by yourself.
Right.
And by default, it's selected for this kind of team environment, which I think a lot of people, and like, let's be honest, I know my upbringing and I see it reflected back in a lot of people I train. A lot of us get into this because there's something missing, or maybe we're a little insecure. I feel like we're all the kid in the old Charles Atlas ads getting sand kicked in his face, right? So once you kind of add the ability to get a little bigger and stronger and give yourself a backbone, and you kind of fill in that like family group team dynamic, it's an addictive environment. So I can see why it pulls in people so hard.
Yeah, you touch on a couple of really important points. It is kind of a family environment in many, many cases. I mean, nowadays it can be a lot different. You have a lot of solo lifters that are doing really, really well, but it was always kind of a family, where I was with powerlifting. I was competing with like the Lillibridges and Pete Rubish and Paul Carters and Marshall Johnsons and all these monsters at like the UPA meets. And they were all like, they weren't like, divas. They were just like dudes like you, like Eric Lillibridge, called my third deadlift at a meet. I was always the guy deadlifting before him. And, it wasn't like, ooh, Eric Lillibridge. It was like, the guy next to you. And
Yeah.
I really always appreciated that. I don't think if it wasn't for that kind of family support, I would have really developed a passion for, continuing on.
Yeah, now I can relate to all of that. I trained out of East West Strength. Now it's East West Strength. It used to be the Freak Factory in Southern California. And it's interesting because there are shows down there, but there's a couple of hubs that have turned out some fantastic athletes. So I trained under Scott Brengel. I drove an hour every Saturday to train there. I didn't know anything about strongman. I had hoarded some stones at my mom's house. I was like 19, and I think I'd made some makeshift stuff on my own from Home Depot that wasn't very good. But Scott ran a crew, and if there's one thing I learned from him, I mean, aside from just general training stuff, it was how important that commitment was to success. And I want to say he's turned out like 8 pro strongmen out of his gym. It's like a little gym in Costa Mesa, California. I mean, Sean DeMarinis, who got a lightweight and heavyweight pro card. Leifa Engels, who was the first to ever win the women's Arnold the first year they had it. Casey Garrison. A lot of good athletes came out of there. But even though those are the stories that my palms still get sweaty, because I remember driving away and like pulling off into the gas station down the street and falling out of my car into the asphalt so they wouldn't see me like soaked in sweat and
Right.
pale white. It's like, don't let them see you cry. It was very hard work and they had very high expectations, but I have such fond memories of what that connectedness was, because that was what drove everybody's success. It was stuff you would not have done if you were by yourself. And that's it's hugely
Yes.
important. I mean, for success, but also for like character development, learning how to exist in a team environment. There's a lot of layers to it.
Yeah, and doing things you wouldn't normally do. those types of groups or communities, they would lift you up to a certain degree. Like you would try things you wouldn't try, or do things you wouldn't do, or lift variations. Like it wasn't a choice. Get under the bar and do it. Like when I moved to South Carolina, I got to train with Donnie Thompson for about a year. And Donnie Thompson's Donnie Thompson, man. If Donnie Thompson tells you to do something, you do it. You don't ask questions. But you would learn things and grow in new ways. I want to change directions a little bit, Alex, and talk to you about the death of powerlifting, and let me frame what I mean. I think around 2010, 2011, 2012, powerlifting's kind of growing. You see more equipped stuff. And there was almost this, like you almost had these writers talking about the death of powerlifting. Yeah, I'm not sure if you remember those days. I had a couple buddies who I remember like Jonathan Bird writing about the death of powerlifting. But since that time, it's grown into this whole different world. Like back then, back around 2012, I was training for a 2,000-pound raw total. I never got it. I was pretty close to 1,900 in the gym, and a gym lift is a gym lift. We all know that. But back then, there was only 82 guys that had hit a 2,000-pound raw total. And I think there's 2 billion right now. Last time what have you seen in the last 10 years as far as the growth of the sport?
Well, real quick, what was the context of the death of powerlifting? Because there's so many different,
Oh man,
there's so many different little sects that people are in that can mean a lot of different things. I mean, was it the death of equipped lifting or the death of the sport because it was too watered down? Like, what were they talking about?
I think there was various arguments, like equip lifting was going to kill the sport and make it more niche, and that it was too hardcore, and people were gravitating towards like CrossFit, and because of all this stuff, people were going to gravitate towards CrossFit. And you still had a lot of the powerlifters are fat kind of chuckle stuff, and all this kind of combined was like powerlifting is just going to die.
Yeah, so in hindsight, we can see what the actual trend was. But if you put yourself in that timeline, I think that's funny because in 2012, if you compare powerlifting to where it was in 1998, it's just night and day. It's already 5 times more popular. It's already having an influx of raw lifters and pulling people away from CrossFit because it was very easy to access. And everybody and their mom squats, benches, and deadlifts. So if you have these easy competitions for people that don't need a lot of experience to just go in and see how they do, there's a reason it's popular, and it also looks good on Instagram. But if I put myself back then, or at any other point for that matter, people always get in these conversations about sport, growing the sport. I deal with it in strongman all the time. And it's like, I get why people care about it. I just don't care about it at all because I know why I compete. I know what it's done for me. And that's the value that I put in it. And once it stops giving that return, I have other things I can focus on, or I can focus on coaching. But my life isn't made better because 10 times more people pick up a barbell. It's not obvious to me that their lives would be better too if they don't get the same thing out of it that I did. So, everybody wants to grow strongman. I'm like, well, that's great. I mean, I want more people in team environments pushing themselves, learning competition and sportsmanship. I want people, less obese. I want all of these things. But the way it becomes this other thing, because the mission of get more people in the sport becomes just car salesman tactics. And it's like, well, how can we compete with CrossFit? And it's like, you're not CrossFit. Like, your mission's different. Your objective is different. The type of people you're going to attract are different. So if you're just trying to capture people for the sake of it, you do that by watering down the sport and eliminating all the things that are valuable about it to begin with. And I've seen that immensely. So when I first became aware of powerlifting, I think the first issue of Powerlifting USA I'd ever gotten was either 99 or 2000. You're talking about, Y2K era. And I remember there was an interview with Brian Schoenfeld. He was a world's strongest man competitor. That's what stood out to me, but he also had a long powerlifting career. And he said in no uncertain terms, I think there are too many divisions, but that's never going to change because people don't want to give up their records. And that was 22, 23 years ago. And it's only multiplied since then. So now you have the state of the sport, powerlifting specifically, a bunch of different federations. So everybody can compete how they want to, not based on some set amount of rules. Suit, no suit, single ply, multiply, knee wraps, knee sleeves, toe string sandals, and a thong. Like however you want to lift, you have your own little division. So you never have to be inconvenienced. Then people have kind of learned to expect that they're not really obligated to compete against anybody better than them. So in my mind, you have the death of sportsmanship because everybody's fixated on body weight. People don't want to get bigger in order to get strong. If they started out 145 pounds, they want to stay 145 pounds. Actually, they want to cut down to 132. People put off competing more and more. Strongman novice divisions have taken over. Strongman competitions were already open to absolutely anybody. And now they have a novice division. And you got this big problem with guys that have been lifting for 10 years that have 650 deadlifts saying, well, I'm a novice, and they'll go run over guys that have been lifting for 6 months. So I don't have a strong opinion. These are always problems you're going to have. It's very much an amateur competition. It's propped up by the people that pay to compete as opposed to the pro athletes that drive in ad revenue. So how you handle that exactly, I don't know that there is one right answer, but I've definitely seen a cultural shift as more people have come into it. And I don't think all of it's positive.
No, well, I want to talk about training a little bit because, we've both been around to see trends. And I would like to get your thoughts on this because there's certain things, I don't want to make this about my beliefs. I want to explore your beliefs. But we were rolling along in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And I would say, a lot of lifters, power lifters and bodybuilders, they'd have off seasons. They do their muscle training, they do their base building. And then we kind of, around the time where powerlifting started to take off, we kind of dove back into these minimal types of programs where, like strong lift, novices squatting 3 times a week and only doing like 5 barbell movements. And I talked with Stan Efferding about this. I don't always feel it's best or conducive for building a base or best for off season, but all of a sudden everybody's training year round using minimal lifts, no off season. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on how that type of minimal type of programming has changed lifting?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I was spinning this around in my head pretty recently as I was trying to come up with like what my default mode for training newbies should be. Because when you're new, you kind of get better from doing anything. But that can also have some big implications for where you're going to be by the time you're intermediate. If somebody starts with strong lifts or starting strength, and somebody else starts with just basic bodybuilding, by the time they get to intermediate status, however you define that, they're going to have a different set of issues, I think, as far as how they have to progress in order to keep going. And in general sports development, this is a big topic. It's how do you train like youth athletes? How do you train people that are new? And the universal consensus is like, everybody thinks if you want the next Tiger Woods, you give them a golf club when they're 4 and that's all they do. Right. And it's the opposite of that. You actually have to have your kids play a variety of sports, not just to avoid burnout so they don't hate what they're doing. I mean, that's important, but also so that they get driver's ed for their body. They learn how to handle all these complex movement patterns. They build more muscle. They have less weaknesses. They are comfortable in different training thresholds. There's so many things that variety does. So it's funny because Ripito pushed the keep it simple. And it is an idiot-proof program, and that's what I like about it, and that's why it's so accessible. And it does work for new people. I can write it on a cocktail napkin. If somebody asks me at a restaurant, hey, I want to start lifting, what do I do? I can write this out, give it to them, and say, go nuts. However, Boris Shako, for example, probably one of the most decorated powerlifting coaches of all time, comes from the Russian/Soviet system. I've read through his textbook multiple times. He has a novice program, and it's written exactly like you would expect a sporting program to be written. He has body weight movements, he has dumbbell movements, he has unilateral movements, and he has a little bit of barbell work to get you comfortable with it. But it's obvious that he's trying to build a foundation. Which one's better or worse? I don't know. It probably hinges on how much access to supervision they have. And I think that makes programming more or less appropriate. Westside, for example, I've had critique of it. I've never said it doesn't work or can't work, but it's most appropriate for people that are working close to somebody that has that eyeball on them. And if you don't, well, it's like the rules and recommendations have to change.
Well, I would completely agree with you on like West Side, and I will say on programs like even strong lifts and starting strength, where you're like strong lifts, you take a novice and you have them squat 3 times a week, and if 90% of folks that come to you need squat work, right? They need time with the squat,
Yeah.
and to just get under the bar and try to add 5 pounds or 10 pounds every week before you have some supervision and actually are able to get much out of it is usually a recipe for lower back injuries or frustration, etc. So I like the point you made. Um, those are there are many strength programs that you really need some good supervision with to get anything out of them.
Yeah, and that's true. And the more moving pieces there are, the more supervision you need. With starting strength what have you, similar type programs, and it's something I don't have an answer to. I think there's going to be a trade-off no matter what you do. Excuse me. Because all lifting is going to require some experience. And it's this question of like, well, are you going to start with a lot of skill specific work and then build off that? Or is it more appropriate to just kind of get them to start so they don't put it off or hesitate anymore and figure it out as they go? There seems to be, with novice lifters, and we're talking people that are just getting started, a certain resiliency to burning out from really hard efforts, or even getting injured, because there's a point where you haven't really gotten strong enough to tax your tendons that way. I mean, I've seen some of this stuff that people get away with their first year of lifting if they get pinned under a squat or if they're round in their back during a deadlift. I remember what I used to get away with, and if I did that with the loads I was handling now, tendons would fly off the bone. So I think by virtue of being new and not really being able to hit the gas that much, you get a little bit of a cushion. There's an assumption that you're going to kind of figure it out as you go, which will certainly apply to some people. It's not going to apply to some. And I've known intermediates, even people you might think of as advanced, who have some pretty egregious form discrepancies. And then that gets into a whole different debate, which is its own can of worms, which is, to what degree do you adapt to like shitty or non-optimal form? If that's the way you've always done it, do you insulate yourself to it? I tend to think that, like any other sport, technique and form does matter. I mean, even if not for injury prevention, which I think it does, but just for being efficient and knowing what you're doing and holding yourself accountable. Because if you're supposed to be picking apart your training, if you don't even have a sense of your setup or why you move the way you move, like how equipped are you going to be to make those high level training decisions? But it's not an easy topic to get to the bottom of, as you might think it would be.
I think we both all been scrolling through Instagram at some point and saw some guy yank 650 and nearly shit out his spine. And we're like, oh my, I just wish he would get like some help, just some help. It's none of my business. I'm not going to hop in and critique him, but it's easy to look at those guys. And like you said, you can process, did he just adapt to that style of training? Or is he one of the lucky ones that survived?
That's it. It's survivor bias. It's survivorship bias, because you get to see the people pulling like that. It's like the old analogy. The old war story. You got planes coming back from the war field and they were riddled with bullets. So they looked where all the bullet holes were and reinforced those areas with steel. So it's like, okay, well, these are the spots that we're going to add more sidewalls to. We're going to make them more durable, less more prone to getting bullet holes in them. And it actually had the opposite effect, because what they weren't seeing is where the bullet holes would hit that would make the plane go down, because they never made it back. So they were reinforcing all the wrong areas. So when you see these people, you see the people that survive. These are the ones that, for whatever reason, it could be, I think people have a durability factor that we can't really measure for. Thicker tendons, or maybe lower tendon insertions, maybe better leverages, maybe your body just processes or synthesizes protein differently. I think there are things that make some people handle beat down a little bit better than maybe everybody does. And that's why I think it's not necessarily enough to look at like the aggregate of lifters and try to come up with rules that fit everybody. I know the tightrope I have to walk to be able to progress strength. There's a lot more things I can't get away with than things that I can. And I'm not everybody, but I know I'm not unique. So there's a certain dismissiveness I see that really rubs me the wrong way, because the human body adapts right up until it doesn't. And if instead of looking at the group, if you're looking at the individual that has those issues, it's like, well, how do you get them to not experience those issues? We got to get the root of how they're moving and what is causing those things to flare up. And it's always going to come back to, how is your body experiencing this load, and how can you, how tolerant are you to it? I think a lot of those guys that get away with that have optimal leverages. So if your knees and hips are a little more open, if your back is a little shorter respective to your height, the torque is less at your lower back. I think there's little things like that that end up making a big difference when it comes to who can just keep pulling recklessly versus who has to be a little more wise to their setup.
I remember back when I was getting seriously into powerlifting, I was working at Muscle and Strength at the time. I wasn't in the direct circle of Lane Norton, but I was, people I worked with in the industry, with Cybation, I got to interact with Lane Norton a few times. And I remember Lane, if anybody shares this with Lane, it's not an attack on Lane, but it's an example of, I remember looking at his squat and saying, holy shit, I would die. Right. Like, but Lane, I think Lane ended up getting injured, but that happens to nearly all power lifters that stay in the game long enough.
Yeah.
So, but I remember thinking, man, if I could just help Lane for like 10 minutes. But, Lane outlifted me pound for pound. So I have nothing to say. But, the mental strength, there are so many aspects to strength training, the mental strength, the tendon strength and connective tissue strength, is just so many things that drove him to be successful that are intangibles.
Yeah. And I always hesitate to get on this topic because it's something that I've probably given a little bit more of my content attention to recently. And it gets a lot of pushback because there's some really, really impassioned disciples of a lot of the what you would call evidence-based
Right.
type of lifters, people with all the letters after their names, whether they're doctors or exercise science, or whether they're just really good at reading through endless amounts of research. The problem that you're always going to come into that you can't reconcile when you're trying to use the research for recommendations is that none of the research has context, and the context involves so many variables. You can't parse out what's meaningful and what's noise and what's going to be particular to an individual. So you look at someone like Lane, it's like, and I think I know what you're talking about. I don't know if it used to be worse, but he has kind of a unique build. So when he squats, he folds over quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I think he gets pretty deep in a bent over position, which is kind of unique. A lot of people can't do that. But I remember seeing his kind of journey through back injuries, and I actually caught him on the Barbell Medicine podcast, which was an interesting listen, because those guys are they're very much like you adapt. Like, people kind of lose their minds over technique. You don't need to measure millimeters of hip shift or constantly screw around with your toe angle to find your squat setup, which I don't necessarily believe you need to do either. But they're, I think, less charitable to the idea that the way you move when you lift is a contributor to injury. And it's just not obvious to me that that's the case. And it seems actually a little more obvious that it is a factor. And I don't, especially given how Western medicine is like really shitty when it comes to back injuries. Like, really, really, anybody who's had a back injury and had to seek out professional help, they don't have a lot to say. You see the doctors coming in and they're like, shoulders are already shrugged, like, stop lifting. Here's some pain pills and anti-inflammatories. And, if you piss yourself, we'll do an MRI. If you lose feeling in your legs, we'll do an MRI. But even then, it's like, maybe you need surgery, maybe you don't. It is a mess. So I bias towards, like, I think we know less, like, officially than we would like to think we know. I think that it's so much like general training. There's broad rules, but I think it's really a method of titration. I think you as an individual are always going to be on the hook for figuring out where your tolerance is and experimenting until you get the right answer. I think it's next to useless to try to come up with universal rules for what does or doesn't lead to injury.
Yeah, back then, and I want to backtrack a little bit because I want people to understand some context and things I've learned since then. Back then, when I saw Lane squat, and he was very lawn chair-ish, and that sounds like a criticism, but since diving into coaching, and I've coached everyone from Special Olympians to you name it. A lot. My online coaching is my world. Um, we know that there are different body types and builds, and for some folks, you're coaching and you're like, boy, I wish he would just do high bar because low bar, he kind of folds like a lawn chair. And then they'll say, well, low bar feels great for me. So you're like, okay, we're going to run with this because it feels great for the athlete. And we're just going to give some time with this to see what develops. But back then, when I looked at a squat like Lane's, I didn't have the knowledge base to understand some people, even if you move all the puzzle pieces around perfectly, are still going to squat like that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And especially, I mean, if you've seen a squat just training for a few decades without powerlifting back then, I think it's evolved a lot to where I think there's more around things like squat technique in the last 10 or 15 years than existed in the 10 or 15 years before that. So you were probably just used to seeing how people squat to grow their legs, which is not,
Right.
I mean, that's still viable because you're using it as a developer. You're going to be comfortable in that setup. So I think there's an argument to be made that if it's good as a developmental exercise, you do enough reps with that, you're going to have skill acquisition. There isn't, I don't know to what degree you can predict world records with, or at least optimal performance with a specific technique, because there's always this trade-off of if you do it in a way that optimizes you for the platform, you're sacrificing something developmentally. So the best bench you can do is going to be with a real high arch, real tight grip, real tucked elbows, real reduced range of motion. Well, that's really dog shit for building an upper body that can move a lot of weight. So you're going to need more stuff to round you out. And I think it's similar with things like squatting and even deadlifting. Like sumo, not a great developer. So when I see kids sumo deadlift who have no interest in powerlifting, it's like, well, you're doing that because you saw people do it, not because it's going to give you the same return. You're upright, you're not as hinged over, you're not disadvantaged, and that's what grows you. So, and that's just one facet, right? It's like psychology, like you said. It's like if it feels better, you're going to attack it better. There is no gold standard. There's very vague principles that you can kind of squint from far away and see how they line up with everything else. And sometimes they line up super nicely. Sometimes you have to make some concessions for a longer term plan. And then trying to squeeze in something like prediction of injury risk becomes its own can of worms. So, but that's what makes a good coach. You need enough experience where your pattern recognition is on point. It's not an exact science. I mean, not yet anyways.
No, and a lot of coaching is you have to build some degree of trust sometimes to walk people off the tightrope, and start getting some results. And if someone doesn't buy into your methods as a coach, you got nothing left. So sometimes you kind of have to hold hands and walk slowly. I want to talk about. There's a couple things I want to hit you up on before we drop off, and the science. You mentioned science. Now, I'm older than dirt. I remember how the cavemen lifted, right, back in the day. Um, and I've seen it all. I've seen in my age they started with Arnold, which was kind of the hybrid full body, where he did the full body twice a week, basically, or split into 3 workouts. And then we developed into the body part split world and the Weider world. And then we came back to the muscle protein synthesis world, where you have to train frequently or you're going to die, right? With dramatic echo. And there was a point where we became so uber scientific that we dismissed the possibility that you can train once a week and get results, or that there might be some regional hypertrophy or regional strength. And now things have kind of come full circle in the science end of things, saying, yeah, regional hypertrophy is probably a thing. Frequency training is just as viable as full body. Everybody just needs to calm down a little bit and be a little less sciencey. Uh, what are your thoughts on science in general?
And by regional hypertrophy, you mean you do one exercise that creates muscle in more areas, or?
Well, there was, I'm not sure if it was Dr. Mike or Schoenfeld or who was talking about it. I heard a bunch of them kind of agreeing that there was some science, some modern science that kind of debunked that regional hypertrophy was a myth. Like if you do incline bench, it does indeed, target the upper pecs maybe a little bit more.
Oh, I got you. Yeah. Where before they were just saying that if the pec is tensed, the pec is tensed, and that's all there is to it. Right. Yeah. And bodybuilders for decades kind of intuitively knew that, right? Like, and this is a truism. Anybody that's being honest, science, as in like the formal academic institution that looks into all of this stuff using experiments that are heavily controlled and get written up and put into peer-reviewed journals. The truism is that it is behind what people just do out in the world, but it's been that way for a very long time. And I think it's further behind than most people think. And when I say behind, meaning the way you take a really hard, firm science like physics or engineering, chemistry, whatever, all of the things you're measuring and quantifying are the same in every scenario. They all follow elegant and easy to follow mathematical rules. They're fungible, which means they're the same. An electron is an electron. An object in space you can measure and apply the same principles as the person sitting next to you. And that gives you predictive ability. That gives you the ability to know the physical world and chart out a path where there's no doubt about it. If we build this spaceship this way, it will land, a fragile egg safely on Mars. I think there is, God, I could get into a big philosophical discussion, but I think there are a lot of people that approach science with their identity as an intelligent or science-minded, objective person first, and that identity component kind of lights up when you hear the term science or when you see people going over peer-reviewed research. And I think that does a disservice because it leads you to stop being critical, because you don't view it as, within the field of science, how are we going to be critical so we make sure we get the right answer? Instead, you end up viewing it as, well, there's us on the side of science and then there's everybody over there. So you immediately create this kind of tribalistic mindset where you're kind of defending your side. And that's never how it should go, because you end up at the same superstitious or kind of dismissive perspective that you would anywhere else that doesn't have science, where you or that doesn't have like empiricism built out to the same degree. So I think people instinctively, in their ability or in their need to defend that field, I think they end up overreaching. I did a chop up the other day where I was reviewing, a single topic, training to failure, which anybody who has been training will say, yeah, training to failure is effective. You might have to adjust some things. You're not going to train the same way. Split might have to be different. Exercise might have to be different, but it's effective. And hey, also there's a lot of people that don't do that and get results. And hey, if you did it one way for a long time and then you change it, that's also something you're going to be sensitive to. So you're going to start growing in. So it's a meaningful use of variation. The amount of nonsense that people start discussing, trying to use the science to inform their decision, it's so much doublespeak and hypotheticals, and then they end up just defaulting back to what kind of normal training wisdom tells you anyways. And these guys from Data-Driven Strength, Zach Robinson, I think was his name, made very clear through his interview, and I had a lot of respect for it, because a lot of the other guys that brand themselves off the science don't go so far as to say it. He said, we don't have a lot of these studies that we need. There's a lot we don't know. This stuff is hypothesis generating, not recommendation generating. That means you're never, ever going to look at a study, look at at least not currently, look at the conclusions, and then decide how you're going to run your program. Mainly because there's zero context to it. And training for good training, everything is context, and context is the only thing that matters. So I think it's a seedling enterprise. I think it needs to treat itself that way if it doesn't want to, continue overreaching and looking foolish. And I think if it does that, it'll get the respect it deserves. But as long as people have an incentive to represent themselves from that angle, they will. We talked about it earlier, making those statements, having that little demon on your shoulder telling you like, no, just commit. Like, this is the best way to do things. This is optimal. And a lot of it ends up being dumb questions anyways, because best and optimal is relative to the person. It's relative to the training style. And that even by itself is going to change 2 years down the road when you've already adapted to what you were doing and you need something else entirely. So,
yeah, best and optimal are often painted as like jumping the Grand Canyon when they're probably like just a little bit trivial difference.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. It's the cherry on top.
And, I got to tell you, like, when you look at my face, and I don't need you to stare deeply into my eyes, but 90% of the wrinkles and stress I've endured over the years was pushing back against science. And let me explain. And this kind of piggybacks on what you said, because I come from a science background. I went to college for astrophysics. I love space science. I love math. I love logic. And science was being open. What does this tell us? What more can we pursue, etc. But science, modern lifting science, in many ways is like the door's closed. This is the final answer. Shut up and march in lockstep. Like, no. For example, when I came, when I went to work for Muscle and Strength, this is hilarious to me. This will show you the round and round we go. I talked about the possibility that full body training might be okay for people because it was all body part splits. And the head of the form at the time was a bodybuilder from the UK. He wanted me fired because of such controversial speak, anti-science speak. Then we're like 3 years later, and I'm telling people, everybody I've ever talked to with results, like 99.7% have used body part splits. Body part splits are viable. And that was in the muscle protein synthesis era, where that was the only variable that mattered. And if you didn't get on that train, all 7,432,000 other variables didn't matter, right? So people called me a heretic, both at the same time, for proclaiming full body, and then a couple of years later for proclaiming body part splits were viable.
When all you need are eyeballs and some experience to know that there have been people who have been successful with both. And it's like, why would one, like you just said, why would that one variable be so important? Especially when, and this is how I conceptualize it, you have a million dials on the wall that, depending on where they're turned, that constitutes what your training program is. When you turn one, all of the others have to change for you to do it well.
Right.
So when I'm thinking of a study that, let's say, wants to compare volume, so they're controlling for volume, right? Well, I know how I would set up a high volume program versus how I would set up a high intensity program.
Right.
And that involves knowledge, that involves this context, this experience with all this other context. And the ability for people to study those things, to even come up with the question, is kind of past the limits of the field right now. But to be able to actually come up with a way where you could test it, we're so far away from that. And like you said, it's not jumping the Grand Canyon. It is marginal. The basic rules work for everybody. And part of the basic rules is holding yourself accountable to adjust based on what you experience. It's titration. It's ticking up based on your body will always tell you if you got the right answer, right? No dogma needed. Did I grow? I didn't get the right answer. Okay, what do I need to change? And starting with the idea that there is such thing as right, or that there is one variable that is so important, it defies what we observe. Even if we get to the point where we have such a robust amount of data and we've gone through the pains of coming up with algorithms to apply it to each individual based on X, Y, or Z, and chart their progress and make moment by moment changes depending on how they adapt. Because it's not just enough to ask what you do with one person. That's one dimension. The person changes over time. So you have to chart how those changes occur, because that's going to merit something else. even if we did that, and you could see, oh, we get a 5% or let's say a 20% greater return over a training lifetime. At that point in the future, the human body is going to be obsolete. At that point in the future, we're going to have robot limbs and exoskeletons
exactly.
and gene editing. It's like how much we know this already. A successful athletic program or even a successful lifting program, it is so much more about recruiting talent than it is about programming, which is why when we see the top 10 or top 100 in powerlifting, we see so many different approaches to lifting because the talented guys, the fast gainers, the people with elephant bones and thick, deep tendon insertions are going to respond exponentially better to whatever they do. So if you can do gene editing, if you can change the way they synthesize protein, it's like, this is your optimal programming. This is what you did by engaging in something like that. So I don't even really see it as a worthwhile field, which is very, very unpopular. And I'm going to catch a lot of shit for that. But that's how I feel about it.
No, I appreciate your thoughts on that. I'm going to give one more example, and then we're going to move on to the last topic. But it's like what I mentioned earlier. Like for years and years, bodybuilders were using different exercises to stimulate the muscle differently, and there was a period in time where it was like the thing from Carrie, where we're all going to laugh at you. You're just an idiot, right? But like we know as coaches that you can do one exercise over and over and over again for a decade, but if you introduce a different variation, like when I trained with Donnie Thompson, he made me do safety bar squats, and I'd never done those before, but I'd done 30 years of squatting. A little variation change will target the body differently. So we have that knowledge that's up against all exercises are the same. Stop being an idiot type of thinking.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Did I phrase that the right way?
Yeah, it does. As far as like, I mean, I always go back to like, what do we know fundamentally and how much can we build off that with certainty? And I see the thing that is required. I mean, if we're just talking about muscular growth, let's just say a generic individual who doesn't even compete, just wants to grow muscle and look aesthetic and symmetrical. The minimum amount you need is an exercise that puts tension on a muscle. Like you could hypothetically get somebody to do only machines. And in fact, there's some bodybuilders that don't do a lot of barbell stuff. And you could very easily have them grow. The important thing is that there's an external stress, and then that stress progresses forward over time, meaning at some point, you do this workout, you're not used to it, you tick forward. As you get used to it, suddenly that workout isn't enough. So now you need to come up here and continue moving forward. Eventually, the same old thing, your body becomes so acclimated that the split, the types of exercise you're doing, the tempo, the range of motion you're using, the effort you're using, the rep range you're using, all of those, your body becomes so desensitized to that it's like another day at work. It's like if I've been working construction for 10 years, it doesn't matter what job I'm doing. I'm not going to continuously get stronger or more conditioned because I'm working on a different building. So then you need to incorporate novelty. It's the earliest advice you get, right? It's like, oh, bro, you got to switch it up. It's like, well, I've been working out for a week. It's like, I don't care. You got to switch it up. That's how you keep growing. That's like the first advice you get when you're in the pit at 24-hour fitness or whatever.
Right.
And the switch up is how long-term progress occurs. And I referred to it earlier. That's the dimension that people don't take into account. Periodization does that just by changing the threshold. And you can do the exact same movements. And if you're rotating through different training thresholds, you will continue to grow long-term. And it has the added benefit of directing you to a peak for a meet. But even if you don't compete, you need this ebb and flow back and forth. And of all of the things I can think of, like you can fix any one thing to the wall. And if you rotate some other things, you can train just fives your entire life. And if that gets stale and you rotate over to something that has you move, like a safety bar squat, that's great. Your body's disadvantaged. It doesn't know what to do with it. It's a different movement pattern. More adaptation takes place. So the certainty that you're talking about, people have this certainty, like doing this particular exercise or varying it a certain way, that doesn't matter or it's extremely important. It's like the longer I do this, I just think of there being like fewer and fewer hard right answers.
Right. Yeah, that's how I feel. Exactly. And I'm gonna ask you one more thing, and I'll let you go. I appreciate your time. I saw you
Absolutely.
do a video on the science of training to failure, and we don't need to dive into that too much, but I think I see Dr. Mike on your thumbnail, and it reminded me of the near endless Lyle Dr. Mike. I'm not sure if you watched that whole drama about what is failure, what isn't failure, that's not failure, this is failure. And it kind of cracked me up because none of this is really helping anybody. But man, we got these brilliant minds just wasting time.
Yeah, Mike is probably the guy I like the most out of that whole field because, and it's not that I care that he has a PhD, it's that he's accomplished. He's a good coach. He can break down complex ideas in a concrete way. He can tell you kind of where the barriers are, so you can kind of find your way on your own. And without the coaching experience and the practical experience, I'd probably look at him just like I would look at, like, I don't know, an Eric Helms or anybody else who's not really known for lifting or coaching, that just kind of has an academic background. Mike actually got put on a thumbnail because the only point he comes up in that video is at the end, and it's in a response video he's making to Lyle. And it's where he's going around with his buddies and they're training to failure because Lyle accused them of like claiming they're going to 0 reps in reserve, but not. So he's doing his workout. And then it got layered because I was actually clipped Schofield's video where he's responding to it. And he's like putting a timer next to their reps to like see how fast they move to try to estimate, like, is that close to failure? And you can get so lost to the argument. It's a very simple argument. Like, are you training to failure or are you not? It's like, wow, we really don't even have the ability to standardize that. Even somebody who's been around for a very long time, we have like doubt as to whether or not it actually went to failure. Like with powerlifting, we live in a world with the internet and social media, and everybody's got a camera. And with 3 judges, a live audience, and infinite different camera angles, we still can't agree if somebody squatted to depth or not. And the type of study that we do controlling for these variables, I mean, controlling for that's hugely important if you're going to make a study about it, but we don't have the definitions, and you can't control for anything if you can't control for your definition from the start, from the get-go. And in the middle of that video, there's a clip of Jeff Nippert on Fuad's podcast. And Fuad's a bodybuilder. He's jacked, he's big. A lot of powerlifting stuff seems foreign to him. You get the sense he's talking to somebody from a different planet when he starts getting into this stuff. But he's a trooper. He pushes on and asks a lot of questions. But he hit the nail on the head. He's like, people talk about this, and it's like somebody says it means this, and somebody says it means that. It seems like nobody really agrees on what it means or what it is or what the definition is. And that's absolutely right. And I think you're going to see everybody do this in every scientific field. You get people that are so myopic and focused on what the cutting edge is that they get in these little pissing matches and they're trying to volley for ground. But if you pull the lens back and see like what that discussion has to offer anybody else, nothing, literally nothing. Nobody's training was made better for that discussion. Nobody is finding a competitive edge. Nobody is breaking through plateaus, and nobody is getting a better idea of how to make their training viable long-term. So I get very, very critical of that field for that reason. I think it becomes a distraction.
Yeah, and so much time. I do respect Dr. Mike, and I like listening to him speak. I always learn some things, and he has a lot of good wisdom. But man, that was more like watching a circus act than it was. I tuned in for the next volley rather than, now we have 22 different ways of training to failure. That's the only thing that came out of this, I think, is now we have 752 different ways of training to failure.
Well, if you think about it too, it's like, what does it mean for a muscle to fail? If I'm holding all of the technical parameters constant, and it is when you can't complete a movement to this technical precision, well, in a compound movement, some muscles are at their limit, but others are fresh.
Right.
Okay, well, now what if you allow for a cheat? And a lot of guys use a little bit of sway. You'll see a lot of bodybuilders, they'll do force reps by default. and they get a little more help, a little more help, a little more help. And even if they stop before they stall out halfway up, that's still getting further into the weeds than, say, a tightly executed movement, done to its limit is. And they're all going to hit you entirely different. And I maintain, like, people bring up Dorian Yates all the time. Well, what if Dorian, who trained very high intensity, didn't do that? And I think if you take anybody who has trained a very rigid methodology for a very long time, and if you get them to break out of it and do something else for a little while, as long as it's not, you're not doing one-legged jumps on a pogo stick, you're doing something that's related to what your end goal is. I think that he would have had another surge of growth in his training, because they have trade-offs. Volume's really high. The trade-off is the weight, the effort has to be low. And conversely, if the effort is very high, your performance goes like this set to set. So, pick your poison. They're appropriate at different points. And that's the answer, is that they both, yes, like all the time.
One of the things that really, I don't know if gets under my skin's the right way of saying it, but I get frustrated with coaches, and I don't want to put air quotes on coaches, but treating all exercises equal. And to your point, like, not all exercises are equal and not all degrees of failure are equal. So you're doing a barbell row, a pendlay row, and your speed noticeably slows. Can you kind of half-ass it and do a couple cheat reps? Yeah, and you might get something out of that, because it might be something else failing. But is there really any downside to throwing a couple cheat rows in a pendlay row, or bicep curls, doing a couple cheat rows at the end of a bicep curl? Not all exercises you can do that. Not all exercises are equal. On bench, you would have to do a forced rep. Just obviously, you don't want to do cheat reps on like pec deck and sporka, increase. But like, one thing in the industry that drives me crazy is when we turn everything into black and white and forget that every exercise is different and it has nuance.
That's completely right. Nuance. And usually when you get people that are kind of judging or trying to talk in one color, is it black or is it white, when they're talking about a method or a movement or anything, any training variable you could talk about, usually they're drawing from just a very narrow band of personal experience, or just giving some lazy, kind of overly simplified, superficial explanation of what's going on. I used to get into this argument all the time. All right, like CrossFit, for example. Anybody who's done like legit lifting looks at CrossFit and they get nauseated when they see kipping pull-ups. Well, I participated in CrossFit for a little while, not outright, but I worked at a gym and I did their strength programming. I got pulled into doing a WOD every now and then. And for a while, I just got a hair up my ass. I'm like, I'm strong. I have a good strength body weight ratio. I should be able to do some of these movements. So I taught myself how to do a kipping pull-up just so I could figure it out. And I'm like, oh, if I have to like get over a wall or something, or climb a tree, or if you're a gymnast, for instance, this is absolutely the most efficient way to do it. And then if you string a bunch of them together, it's like, holy shit, my heart rate's through the roof. I got a bunch of blood in my upper back. My biceps are cramping up. Now, is that what I'm going to do if I'm trying to like add an inch to my chest circumference to get my lats to pop? No, probably not. But it serves its own purpose. It's uniquely difficult, and it's viable as an exercise option depending on what you want to do. And I would compare that when people would get like really vicious. I'm like, well, do you do croc rows? I'm like, well, yeah, I do croc rows. It's like, okay, well, how is that any different? You have a dumbbell strapped to your hand and you're using the entirety of your hips and torso to yank the weight up through a limited range of motion and then drop your chest to it. And it turns out that when you do that with a lot of weight and a fuck ton of effort, you actually grow. And it's actually fantastic for growth. Same thing with a push press.
No, wait. I'm going to stop you there, because I'm going to tag you every time I post a dumbbell row video, because I've always done them like pendlay style, off the ground, not croc where you're hanging them. And I got up to like, we have the Ronnie Coleman dumbbells at an old power station gym, and man, I just always loved powering them off the ground. I'd get up to like 200 by 30s, and every time I post them, I can really feel my back. I know how to drive to feel my back work. I always felt I got a lot out of them, but man, every time I post a video, I'm the biggest idiot on the internet. So I'm just going to tag you next time as
Tag
backup.
me. And this, like, if you're trying to consider, if there's one thing I did well, because I'm, kind of jack of all trades, master of none. I've had my foot in a lot of things, but I've tried really hard through my own failures and the people I've trained to try to figure out how all this connects. Like, why can strongmen get 1,000-pound plus pulls when what they do is kind of night and day from how powerlifters generally train and manage their training? Why do so many different ways seem to converge and get a very, very good results? If I take that thread of logic and this idea of strictness and say, okay, well, that does something and it might be more or less appropriate. Like you said, you feel it. Okay, so there's some intent. You actually kind of know how you're moving. You're not just flopping around on a bench because you want to do something with a big weight. So there's a little bit of skill there. But if I take that thread of logic and move it forward, I can think of, what are we doing? We're moving very explosively, very, very heavy weights that are heavier than you otherwise would be able to handle for longer than you would be able to handle. And I'm like, well, gee, if only there was a sport or field of expertise where people would do that competitively. It's like, there is. Strongman does that. Anybody who's gone through a 2-minute long stone loading medley, anybody who's carried a Husafelt stone or a sandbag for 300 feet or a yoke, when you're dropping and repicking 4, 5, 6 times within a minute and a half, that goes so far beyond what a normal lifting set does with so much more weight. And the first time you do it, it messes you up. They call it yoke flu, actually. The first time you do that with a yoke, you take a 500-pound squatter and they carry a 600-pound yoke for the first time. And if they really push into the weeds, it's almost flu-like symptoms that set in because the hit systemically to their body is so substantial. And the end result is your body adapts. Your back thickens out. Your midsection thickens out. Your motor patterning becomes more efficient. And you can apply that to a lot of movements. My shoulders grew in the beginning because I used push presses. Same idea, using the muscles of my legs and hip to jump in and then drive the weight through. I was getting the benefit of a full range of motion, but the explosiveness allowed me to use more weight. It allowed me to do more reps. The end result was my delt being fatigued and strained deeper than it would be. Now, that's not always the case. Base building, we talk about base building. I think it's viable to go back, do some strict work for a while, or at least incorporate more of it in. Don't just put all your eggs in one basket. But I know I can get my shoulders to grow doing nothing but strict behind the neck presses. And I know that if I want to do nothing but jerks and push presses, I could do the same thing.
Yeah, I've always looked at things like strength builds strength. And I've always rode the way I've rode. And, my thought was always, if I can do a 200-pound dumbbell row for 30 reps, then my deadlift's going to be a fuck ton. If I can roll one thing, unilaterally, there's going to be some kind of strength carryover somewhere, but that's a discussion for another time. Before we go, in the world of the YouTubes, is there anything you're seeing that you're liking or anything that currently trends that you wish would go away?
That's funny. I ask all the people I interview the same thing, and I always do it because I'm trying to stir some shit.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. Not real.
No. So the light can be on them instead of me for once.
Yeah.
No. If anybody watches my stuff regularly, they kind of know my stances. I've tried pretty hard over about 300 videos not to have it focus on talking shit or there's this little bubble of criticism. It was like 2 videos of West Side because I was dealing with a lot of people at the time that would come into my gym, novices or early intermediates that were all enamored with West Side. And I would watch them train, not one, not a few, like a dozen. And I would watch them just get stagnant because they were trying to do this mode of training they didn't have supervision for, they weren't equipped to handle. So that was one. I made a couple of videos about that, got my share of pushback. I think I did one video on Joel Seedman, but he's such a ridiculous example of gimmicky bullshit. And my friends, I have one friend who was the head strength and conditioning coach of University of Redlands. Shout out to Joe Buckley, pretty good middleweight strongman as well. And he was really blunt about it. He was like, there's so much gimmicky shit that goes on in the field of strength and conditioning because you have the best performers that you've pre-selected, and that's everything. And strength isn't the most important thing. Winning a football, you just have to not get people injured. So you can have guys come in with a bunch of weird, wonky shit, and they can hide behind the NFL athletes they're working with, which by the way, it is not nearly as difficult to coach pro athletes as one might think. There's tens of thousands of them. They have to go somewhere. If you know somebody who owns a gym, likely it is they have some access to a pro hockey, baseball, college, well, not pro college, but a really good like D1 college team or like pro football or something. And it allows them to hide behind that. I only did one video on Seedman because the whole world's wise to what he's doing. You know, they're not going to benefit from more Seedman videos.
Right.
But basically what we talked about, the evidence-based thing, irks me a little bit, but even that's not a hill I'm going to die on too much, because at the end of the day, if people are lifting weights, they're being consistent, they're being thoughtful about what they're doing, they're still going to grow. And the people who are hell-bent on being competitive, they're the ones that are going to know where they get their information from anyways. There's nobody who's a serious competitor who's digging into PubMed to figure out where their competitive edge is. They're talking to the guys who have been operating off the true principles that have been around for a century and finding out what works for them. And at the end of the day, that's all you can do. So besides that, I don't know. I think natty or not videos are really dumb. That's kind of like empty filler content.
But they're cheaters, Alex. They're cheaters.
They're cheaters. They're cheaters.
Yes.
Well, that's the other thing. There's the subtext that some of the natty guys have, where it's not like this is what we like to do for our own reasons. It's a lot of like hostility. And I used to be that guy. I was a huge natty white knight. I always tell people that when I was 17, 18, 19, and I had to get honest with myself. I knew where it came from. This was my thing. At the time, it was much more of an identity than it is now, because I actually have like a life and obligations and stuff. And I didn't like being threatened. I didn't like somebody who was more jacked than me, stronger than me coming in, giving their 2 cents. Cause I'm like, what do you know? You're a juice monkey. And I had to get real with myself that it did not come from a good place. It didn't come from actually wanting to make the field better. It's kind of selfish and me finding a way to separate myself from everybody else and make what I do more special. And now that I've recognized that, I see it everywhere else. I mean, everybody will default to what is this, the way I can tell this story to where I'm the hero, or I'm the one who's standing on the totem pole of morality, and everybody else is just a dirty cheater. But even if we leave that alone, even if it was just curiosity, who's natty, who's not, you have no ability to tell who's natty. There have been guys who are absolute freaks that I know for a fact have never touched this stuff. And there have been people I know who have been blasting for a decade and look like dog shit. And it's something that you won't understand really until you go on, or until you're actually around a lot of people that go on and are open about it. Right. So I really think the whole thing is motivated out of something that isn't helpful, that isn't useful. I think it's a lot of masturbation. And I don't think it adds anything to anybody's training. I think it's like reality TV. It's TLC for lifters.
And, if a guy's been around for 30, 40 years, 20 years, they've been places, they've probably tried one or two things here or there. It's like such a weird gray area and such a long road. We try to make everything equal. Like one guy tried a D-ball tablet once in 1987. Therefore, he's not natty, and he will never be natty ever again. It's like, come on, guys. It's just.
Well, I've thought about that quite a bit, actually. Like, where's the line? Because there have been people that have gotten popped and come back and compete. And when I was younger, I was like, no, they should be banned for life. And then as you get older, you're like, okay, well, that's ridiculous, because especially if you're on and you got Strongwall on, if you stop, your numbers go through the floor. I went through that. Me and my wife are trying to have a kid. I've been off for 8 months. I'll probably be off for another 8 months. And there was about a 4-month period where I was weaker than when I was 19, just by virtue of hormones kind of reestablishing themselves. And I've since popped up back to normal, like homeostasis. It happens. But I've wondered, like, if I went full natty and that was just my channel and my brand, would the other natties accept me? Am I like no, would they look at me as different because I'm a convert, right? Would they be like, oh, that's a win, we got him over? Or would they have like that one eyebrow raise, like no, like you're pretending, or you're appropriating our nattiness? I have no idea. I honestly don't care. It's like, human beings don't fly in planes because, or we don't fly because we grew wings. We flew because technology allowed us to build planes. That was the analogy. So the use of technology doesn't bother me, but there's a longer discussion, who it's appropriate for, what the dangers are, whatever. But that's not even a big discussion on my channel anyway, so I don't really go into that.
No, I don't really care. PAD stuff bores me. I'm a training guy.
Yeah.
I like training. I like helping people reach their goals. And I'll just leave this story with you, and then we'll hop off. Back when I was about 308 pounds and pretty depressed at the time. I'd been coaching other people, but I hadn't been on the platform like a year. And I went to a UPA meet and kind of got the bug up my ass to compete again. So I ended up gaining like 40 pounds in 4 months. My lifts went through the fucking roof. I was only at the time I was doing like squatting to a daily max for that day, single, double, triple, quad, multiple times a week. I was just doing the big lifts and my lifts were going up ridiculously, but I was literally eating 8,000 calories a day. I got to, 1850, 1900 in the gym. And back then it's like, steroid abuser and like, man, the only thing I abused was food, and then now here we are, like 8 years later, and I'm weak compared to everybody else. So, I was just a weak fat ass. So it's kind of funny how things go.
Yeah, I did. I had gone through the dirty bulk phase, and I think I was just committing to competing. I was 19, 20, 21. And I'm like, I want to be a 330-pound strongman. Granted, I'm like 5'10". And I started doing the gallon of milk a day. And I was working as a trainer at the time. So we had these like tight, and I've never been really lean, but we had these tight fitting, like silk-like athletic shirts. And I just remember my stomach started to get tighter and tighter and tighter. But I was like, I broke my 600-pound deadlift. I broke my 400-pound bench. I'm like, I didn't care. I was happy. But that whole phase, the hallmark was a ridiculous excess of calories, sugar, just breakfast, lunch, and dinner, insulin
Right.
levels through the roof. Not a good way to look, not a good way to live. And in hindsight, I don't think better than, I would say if I were to do it all over again, I just learned to eat like a bodybuilder. There's no reason not to, because that diet is designed to maximize muscle growth and keep body fat minimal. If you're a strength athlete, you can't improve upon that. You cannot get better than a diet that is designed to do those things. So, for a real hard gainer wanting to break through, that's one thing, 2-3 months of excess calories. But for 99% of the population, it's like, it's another avenue to just fat fucking yourself. And it's,
Yeah. You're familiar with Alpha Destiny, I would assume, like
yeah.
everybody is. Like, we talked once that the best strength gains of our life was when we were eating like a fat ass, but it's also completely not sustainable. And it just ends up in so many bad places that, eventually you're going to. Sorry, my screen just disappeared. Eventually you're going to have to cut that weight off and find a way to take care of yourself again.
Yeah. And if you're good at doing that, that means you're good to have a good diet in the first place. The people who it appeals to, and I think I've been guilty of promoting in the past, because it can be a useful plateau buster, especially for hard gainers. But whatever fat you do gain, it's hard not to get a complex, because now you're having to run the complete opposite direction and get that fat off without losing all the gains. And that takes a very certain amount of skill and a certain personality, and it's hard to do. If you're going to be doing this for a while, you're best off just, I say the word titrate a lot, just steadily increasing over time and letting your previous results dictate what you do next. There is no meteoric rise unless you're that 1 in 10,000 that's
Right.
a super fast gainer. There is no meteoric rise, regardless of the drugs, regardless of the training. You got to get in, you got to grind, and you can't be relying on shortcuts.
Yeah, it's a long game, and if you don't love it, you're in deep trouble.
Yeah,
I'd like to have you back on sometime, man, to just dive into nutrition, because we didn't talk about that at all, and just what your philosophies are, what you believe. There's a lot of crazy stuff out there right now, and maybe we can have you back on sometime if you want to come back. One final question for you. And this is just like, you are framed 1/3 of the way into the side of the screen. That's kind of like a photographer's trick to get the most beauty out of a screen. Is that on purpose so we like you more, or is that just random luck?
It's all about aesthetics and manipulation. You know, I'm built like a thumb, and I have a lot of Hobbit features, so I got to use camera manipulation. No, actually, I have a green screen behind me, so I had to like wiggle the wiggle the laptop, and I didn't feel like sliding my chair over. But hey, happy accident. If it works in my favor, I'll take it.
Yes, I was watching a couple of videos on, I'm really kind of a one cut, one take guy, and I thought I'd watch a couple videos on how to improve my editing and videos, and they're like, make sure you're like 1/3 of the way onto the screen, and that looks visually more aesthetic. Like, fuck that.
Yeah, you work
All
out
right,
the substance first.
all right, man. I appreciate you joining me. And anytime you want to come back, I'd love to have you on. Good conversation. Again, before we go, let everybody know where they can find you.
My YouTube channel is just Alexander Bromley. I have about around 300 videos up of training breakdowns, whiteboard presentations, how I structure training, reviewing other training programs. I go deep into that. Instagram is just Alex Bromley with 2 underscores in between. And EmpireBarbellStore.com or Amazon, you can find my books and some merchandise. And that's about it.
Yeah, I got your book right here in my library. I appreciate it.
Awesome, man. That's great.
You bet. I appreciate it, and then we'll talk to you next time.
Of course. Thanks for having me.